My name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and welcome to Wellness Live, the program where we here at Loma Linda University Health bring wellness to you. Well, today we have a very interesting subject for all of you who have worked in a workplace. Now, some of you might know that when you're passionate about something, or you have a strong personality, or you are around different personalities at work, and we spend a lot of time at work, that sometimes conflicts can arise. And it can be very stressful, not only for people who are in the conflict, but everyone around the conflict. But the exciting news is that we can actually turn conflict into collaboration. So we have a very important guest with us today. I'm very excited to have Lizette Norton, who is the Vice President of Human Resources Management here at Loma Linda University Health. And she has actually been doing HR, or in the HR space, for over 30 years. So she's an excellent person to talk about conflict to collaboration. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Lizette Norton.
Thank you. Thank you, Olivia. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about conflict and how you can turn conflict into collaboration. All right. The objective today is we want to talk through how you can make something that often we look at it as a negative into a positive. Because conflict doesn't always have to be negative. Conflict can be part of our growth, professional growth, if we're able to see it from a different perspective. You can see in my slide here that I'm going to share with you conflict not always being negative, trying to turn it into something that where you can grow. And let me go to the next one. I'm going to divide it so you can see when it becomes negative and when it could be positive. Obviously, it's negative when the differences are not addressed right away. People sometimes feel uncomfortable about dealing with situations and they think it's going to go away, but it doesn't always go away. Expectations are not managed. Assumptions, sometimes we assume things and they're not necessarily facts. And then the individuals involved, affected, are not always wanting to be part of the solution. On the other side, positive conflict could be when we value and honor the differences between people. Again, just because we have a different point of view doesn't mean that we can't be respectful and accept someone else's point of view. Issues are open and not mass, so we bring things to the table. Ideas, not personalities, are central to the situation. Emotions are managed, and then, of course, points of views expressed in a skillful and respectful manner. So let's look here a little bit at this graph. To move from conflict to collaboration, the relationship process needs to be valued. And the 3 steps that I want to talk to you about today is acknowledging the conflict, assessing it, and addressing it. The first part that we'll talk about is, in acknowledgement, we're going to have to identify the problem, causing the conflict, identifying the feelings associated with the conflict, and then in the assessing, we're going to identify the impact of the problem and decide whether to resolve the conflict or not. Is it important enough? Is it something that we feel we need to address? And then at the end, we're going to talk about the solution, which is how do we address it. So let's go to the first section, the acknowledging it. Part of it is dispelling the myth that conflict is negative. Again, just because you have a different point of view or you're starting to feel conflict and tension between 2 people, it doesn't have to be negative. Recognizing the advantages of good conflict. Because again, sometimes that stretches you. It helps you look at things from a different point of view. And then the parties agree that there is a problem, and then identifying the source of that tension. And there's different areas of sources for tension. There could be the relationship part, which is when you are involving your relationship with others. Is it an employment relationship? Is it a personal relationship? Sometimes that in itself could be a conflict. the data, what data you're working with, that could be what causes the conflict. It could be that you receive wrong data or no data, and you're upset because you received a report that had some information that wasn't what you were expecting, or you didn't receive a report that you were expecting. Interest. The interest, that deals with conflict of interest or competition or perceived interest. And then structural or organizational issues. And then let me go back here. I want to give you an example just to make it a little bit more clear. We had an example in one of our nursing units where there was friction between the nursing staff and the supply chain staff. In the supply room, obviously, that's very important for the nurses. If they need to go in there and get bandages or get something for the patient, they need it, and they need it now when the patient needs it. From the supply center, the purchasing person, their job is to make sure that they go every day and fill those supply rooms. The tension was that often when the nurses needed their supplies, they couldn't find them. On the other side, when the individual that was sent out, or several individuals that were sent out, often they were frustrated because they felt that things weren't where they were supposed to be looking for them. They felt frustrated that that delayed them, so they couldn't go from unit to unit. They would get to the next unit late. But their focus was, I need to bring the supplies, I need to get them in there. And when they looked, they thought, oh, they have what they need, or they don't need this anymore, but often was because things were not in the right location. As we drilled down and found out that there was this conflict kept rising because there was a need that wasn't being met from both sides of, from both departments, we were able to bring them together and kind of analyze to say why, what happened, and why is this causing it? A lot of it, in this case, was very simple. We did not have a standardized process of how we store things. And so in the process of doing that, that meant that in every unit, that person going in to bring in the supplies had to look through everything. Different shelves were different, things were different in every area. And so from that perspective, it was frustrating for the individual from supply chain. By standardizing, doing just some minimal changes to that process, setting some buckets, making sure that things were set in a certain process alphabetically, they could find them. They could say the first bucket always has, a particular supply. The second bucket has the next, maybe bandages. The next one has thermometers or whatever it is that they need. And so from that perspective, by setting some standards, it made a big difference. And it released the pressure and the conflict that both groups were having, each one of them blaming each other for what was needed. Bottom line, they both had the same goal, which was get what the patient need when they need it at the right time, at the right place. But again, a lot of it was misunderstanding, misconception, and not talking to each other. So often, it could have been, in our case here, in the example I was given, it was part of it was structural and organizational. Part of it was data, not data on paper, but data from the point of what was logged in those rooms for what was needed. So again, conflict doesn't always have to be negative. So let's take you through the assessment process. You're going to be looking at facts, and you're going to be looking at individuals involved in the style and their style. It's important to know who you're working with. One of the things to find out when you're trying to find the facts is who, where, when, what, and why. The more information you get, the better you're going to be able to find for a solution. Keep the discussion focused. That's important. Maintain control of the discussion. And ask key questions. Again, going back to the who, when, where, what, and why. And making sure that you're staying to things that are factual and not opinions. Answering the who, and that deals with the style, individual styles. Answering the who helps you know what type of person is this person someone that's more assertive, or is it someone that's more collaborative? Understanding the person's style or the person's personality is going to be key in trying to resolve. the situation or trying to get it back on track to being collaborative versus conflictive.
Well, thank you, Lizette. That's we've gone through the 2 A's. We have a third one coming up, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So I'm excited to get to that. But let's talk a little bit about what you talked about. And for our audience, if you have any questions for Lizette, please send in your questions. We have her here live. So go ahead. If you have any questions about conflict and collaboration, now's the time to ask because we have her in the studio. So Lizette, a little bit about the kind of assessing it, and also it was acknowledge and assess, correct? Mm-hmm. So what happens when you don't acknowledge, and what happens when you acknowledge it later? What are the problems that can arise?
The problems that can arise is people fill the gaps. So if you're not acknowledging that there's an issue, the person that you're having the issue with will make assumptions that you don't care, or make assumptions that, the data you sent is what, the person gave you something on purpose for you not to be able to do your job and do it well. So a lot of assumptions can come into play that are not factual because you're not acknowledging that there is a problem. And without acknowledging it, you can't start the beginning. You can't be at the table to talk it through to say, I do see there's a problem. Let's talk about it. There's sometimes for the people that have a personality that's more passive because they don't like to have conflict. They don't like to, sometimes they don't like to be upfront and dealing with things. It's a little harder because they feel like, well, if I don't deal with it, it'll go away. I can deal with something else and, this is forgotten. Yeah. But depending on the level of what it is, if it affects other people, sometimes it becomes very big. If it's just affecting 2 people, it might not make a bigger impact. Sure. But, it could. It just depends what the issue is. But you have to be careful because if you don't acknowledge it, then you can never really work on it.
What happens when let's say we're in a conflict and I'm acknowledging something or I'm seeing something, but you don't see it at all?
I think one good thing to do in that case is repeat back, because sometimes you think you're hearing, but as part of the listening process, you're converting it to something else because you already have your point of view. And sometimes you haven't opened your mind to accept other people's point of view. And so by repeating it back to say, you know what I'm hearing is that you're frustrated because the report that you receive is missing 2 columns or is missing, a piece of information that's key to you. And by repeating it back, the person can then catch and say, yes, that's correct, or no, that's not it. Let me share it a different way. So I think that's important because it could be that you think you're understanding, but you might not be.
Okay.
So it's important to go back and forth, have that conversation.
Now, in the assess it part of the conflict resolution, how important is gender and gender roles?
It's important from the point of that, depending on what the issue is, something that could be very sensitive, let's say to a female, might not be so sensitive to a male. Or it could be cultural. It could be that, someone raises their voice when they're trying to give some instructions, and in the culture of the person receiving that, that's demeaning or uncomfortable. Maybe in a different culture, it's no big deal. The person doing it might not understand that or see that it's even a big, a problem because they're so used to doing it. So cultural and ethnic and gender is key often to the issue that's at hand.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for answering our questions. Let's get to the second half because I think there's a lot of important things that we can talk about. And if you are watching us live, please go ahead and type in your questions. We're going to have another question and answer for you.
Well, one of the things that you want to do is separate, in assessing it, the people from the problem. Often we focus on the person instead of the problem, and the problem is usually not the person. It could be that the person is the avenue or the person that's giving you, they're giving you something or they're saying something, but really the problem is something else. focus on the interest and not the position. And I'm going to go through these a little bit more in detail so you can understand and get more clearance. Create options, and then insist on using objective criteria, best practices, data, and so forth. So let's go to the first one, people from problem. Try to focus on the problem at hand. In the example that I was giving earlier, the problem was not having the supplies that they needed on time. It wasn't necessarily that the person didn't want to bring it on time, and it wasn't that the nurse was, being rude and complaining. Really, the problem was when there was something needed, you need a bandage for the patient, you weren't getting it. So focus on the problem. And then identify the real from the perceive. Again, sometimes when communication is not happening, people fill the gaps. And from that perspective, then that's a concern. So really focus on the problem and if it's real or perceived. Explain the problem as you see it. Again, the person at the other end might be seeing the problem differently, and so you both might be working on a solution, but to totally two different problems instead of the problem at hand. Discuss the situation together. Again, communication is key. Find common issues and shared goals. I think, again, back to that example that I was giving, the shared goal is we want the patient to have what they need when they need it. And that was a goal that both the supply chain team wanted as well as the nursing team. Maintain constructive relationships. I think it's important as we communicate that we don't put down anyone, that we just stick to the facts and don't make it personal. Get and give feedback. Be proactive, and then put your opinions aside and show interest. I think it's important because if you know that someone feels frustrated about something, it's important for them to know that you care and you want to be part of the solution and not the problem. And then focus on interest, not position. This is where interest is what you need to accomplish, and position is the way to get to what you want. And you want to focus on interest. You want to you want to focus on what do we need to accomplish versus, is it my way or your way? And that's key. And then here's some more. Reveal your interests. What do you need? Make sure that you're both on the same page. Explain why your interest benefits the organization or the individual. I think if people can see the outcome, then they might be more open to slowing down and communicating and being part of the solution. And then explain why it is important, not just what is important. Again, in this case, it was for patient care in the example that I had given. That was very important. We need to make sure that those things that are needed are there when they're needed. And then avoid arguing over position, which goes back to the way we get to it. Let's talk about how we can fix it, not is it your way or the other person's way, but what can we come to an agreement to get to the goal. And then create options. In most conflicts, it's not just one solution. Often there's options to that you can take and be open to that. Again, what might work for one person might not work for the other, and I think you need to be open to different options and solutions. And then explore collective and versus individual points of view. Keep the channels open. When possible, if there's other people that can give input, ask for that. So that can be included in the decision-making process. And then create brainstorming. Allow for discussion back and forth. Again, don't just feel that it's what you're saying, but and then slow down, think it through, take your time. Often the solution, sometimes just waiting a day. Don't feel you have to make a decision immediately. Sometimes you have to have the discussion and then have some time out. Maybe wait for the next day for everyone to think it through and then come back to the table to talk it through. Try to stay focused that this could be a learning process, not just for the outcome of what's going to happen, but how to deal with other situations down the line. So like I said at the beginning, often conflict can stretch us and make us stronger and help us be able to deal with other situations down the line better. And then using objective ideas whenever possible, try to make sure that you're focused on best practice, allow for efficiency and fairness, spend time talking about the possible solutions, are practical and legitimate solutions, and then of course again going back to being fair, doing things that are market value, professional standards, scientific. If you can, be able to share, to be able to say, best practice is this and this is why. It's not just your opinion, but you have some examples of where that particular solution was used somewhere else and was successful. That's going to bring something to the table that will help the other person feel more open to, receiving that information and acting on it. And then again, keeping focused that conflict can always be an opportunity for growth. And we should look at it always from a positive perspective versus always thinking that conflict or disagreements are negative, because we could turn them into collaboration and become stronger for them.
Well, thank you, Lizette. This was really great, and we're getting some really great questions in. So why don't we just get to the questions, because we have a lot of them coming in. When should two parties be encouraged to work it out? That's a good one.
Right from the beginning, when when you see two people, or if maybe it's you with someone else, you shouldn't wait, because sometimes waiting, people start making assumptions. They think that because you're not responding or addressing their concerns, they're going to fill in the gaps. Mm-hmm. So I think right away is important, and that doesn't mean that you can't take time through the process, but I think being able to early on to say, hey, this looks like there's a conflict here. Mm-hmm. Let's talk it through. The sooner the better.
Okay, great. Along those same lines, this person asks, can you speak to the question of when a supervisor should intervene in a conflict?
And usually in HR, we always say, try to take it to the lowest level. We always want the two people to work through it first. Try to encourage them, give them tools to be able to do it if you have to, but try to have the two people work it through first. If that doesn't work, and the individual, someone comes forward and says, I've met 2 times, 3 times, and we're not getting anywhere, then yes, sometimes you need a neutral party to step in and help. But I think it's important, often we counsel the supervisors to talk to both parties and encourage them to meet on their own and try to resolve it and remind them of the outcome. This is the goal. This is what you're supposed to be achieving or addressing. And so then take a step back and go back and talk it through and come back with some solutions.
Okay. And along those same lines, these questions are escalating. When should HR get involved?
Good question. And again, when things come to HR, we usually say, who has been involved and how. We always try to push it back down, because really the two people that can solve it are the two people that have the conflict. Right. We can be mentors. We can be, someone there to coach and assist, but really to really fix it. I mean, yes, we can be dictatorial and say you have to do this, right, but usually that's last resort. And that's when then, maybe a supervisor has to then take over, make a decision and say, okay, we're going to do this process this way because you guys can't agree to a solution. But it's always best to try to go through the process. So when we talk it through with the supervisor, because usually we get the call from the supervisor, and I have 2 people that can't, come to a solution, we try to push it back down. But sometimes we have to step in and help them through the process.
Right, and being in HR for over 30 years, I'm sure you've seen some things.
Well, unless something deals with safety.
Right.
If there's a safety issue, then we step in right away.
Okay, perfect. So one of the questions here, and it's a good question, what kind of resources are available within LLUH to resolve conflict?
Obviously, your supervisor, it would be your first place to go. Talk to your manager, your supervisor, manager, then director. But then there's also the HR partners. We have HR partners on the sites that can be there and help. You can always talk to them, from a point of just having a conversation, not that you want to necessarily even escalate it. Mm-hmm. But we've had times where that happens, and that's why we're there, is to help. If it becomes, like I said, if it becomes a safety issue, a harassment issue, something that looks like it's getting, a lot higher, then of course the corporate HR gets involved, and from that perspective, then we get the employee relations team involved. But there's also lots of things through staff development. There's learning opportunities that can help through that. There's some workshops where we do that. We do workshops on conflict resolution. So go to OWL and see what's there. We try to refresh it, put new things. So you might have taken a class, or we also have a list of books there as well. There's a section where you can also read some books. So there's always ways where we can learn to be stronger and better. But in the midst of a conflict, often people forget that there are those resources, and then that's where the people are there to help.
Right. When you spoke about books, for those individuals who are watching us today who are not part of our LLUH family, are there any books that you would recommend?
Yeah, there's several books, and I can't think of the authors now, but there's many books that talk about conflict resolution. I think if you Google that, you'll be able to get some. You're welcome to call my office and we can share some. In fact, we're now working with staff development to add some more lists on our own website to put some resources there.
So I'm assuming there's a lot of information in this space. Okay.
Yes.
Great. So we have a couple last minute questions here is, how would you tweak these techniques to work with family and teenage children?
That's good. All of these work the same. And I'm going to go back to one of my first slides, because if you use this process right here, you can use this for anything. It could be personal, it could be professional, but it goes back to identifying the problem, what's causing it, and then identifying the feelings. Why is this happening? And then identifying the impact that goes with it. So yes, with a teenage, you could have that, you're having a conflict with your teenage because you want them to come in at a certain time and they're constantly coming in late, or you don't want them to drive the car, whatever it is that you're having. But I think if you follow these steps, identify the problem, the feelings, the impact, and then you can decide, is this something that needs resolution, or is it something that, it's a quick clarification. Sometimes you have to go through a whole process, sometimes you don't. Because sometimes there's assumptions we've made, and once we know that, start that conversation, a quick conversation might resolve it all. But sometimes you do need to go through the process.
And now, just for a last one, because I think it's a good one to end on, because I think it's a tough one for some, what if the conflict is with someone with a higher position?
We get that question often. Again, I think, and I'm hoping here at Loma Linda, that I think most of our departments are very open, and supervisors have open policy. I think it's important to go in and share your feelings. And let's say that it was a comment that was made. Go in and say, when that comment was made at the staff meeting, I was offended, and this is why. Have those conversations. Often is misunderstanding. And once the person knows, then they can, take care of that. If you cannot, if it's something that deals with a conflict between, that you feel that you've gone to your supervisor already, then of course follow chain of command. But again, at any point in time, you can go to the HR partners. You can reach out to HR. You can reach out to HR to just get advice on how to deal with it. Often we will say, if you haven't talked to your supervisor, start there, because most supervisors are in their positions because they want to succeed. They want you to succeed in what you're doing. So they're not going to be negative. Often is misunderstanding of something that was said, or something that you didn't receive, and you think, it was on purpose, and maybe the person thought you received it. So often it's misunderstanding. So I would suggest going and have that conversation. If you need advice on how to have that conversation, feel free to talk to the HR partner, feel free to call us. But we will often send you back and say, have that conversation.
Okay. So here, I think a lot of the take-home message is to make sure that you communicate and be very aware of not only your feelings, but try to look at where somebody else is coming from as well.
Correct.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Lizette, for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. And for all of you who are our audience this evening, we want to just thank you so much for being a viewer of Wellness Live. And we want to invite you back to our next session. Our next session will be next month, and we're going to have Dr. April Wilson. She's the chair of our Preventive Medicine Department here at Loma Linda University. And she is going to be talking about Is what we eat important? And that is going to be an important topic, I think, for all of us, because food is always a topic on everyone's minds. So again, please join us next month for Dr. April Wilson. My name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and we're so happy you joined us, and we'll see you next time.